I shouldn't have gone back to that house. Years had passed since the last time I had been there, yet that feeling of unease never left me. It wasn't a rational decision. Something inside me kept insisting that it was a bad idea, that I shouldn't reopen doors that had been closed for a reason. But curiosity is a treacherous monster, and before I realized it, I was standing before that old structure, staring at its decayed facade, feeling a cold shiver run down my spine. The house had always been strange. Since childhood, I had felt like it was watching me, as if it had eyes hidden within its cracks and shadows. But it was just a house, right? Just walls and rotting wood falling apart with time. Nothing more. That's what I tried to convince myself of as I pushed the door open. It creaked long and slow, almost like a moan. The air inside was heavy, stale, carrying the scent of something old, somewhere between damp wood and dust accumulated for decades. The silence was absolute. No breeze, no sound of insects. Only the echo of my own footsteps reverberating through the empty rooms. Every step inside that house felt like a mistake. The floor groaned beneath my weight, and the feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing second. I should have left. I should have turned around and pretended I was never there. But something held me in place. An invisible thread pulling my curiosity towards something I couldn't name. That's when I started to hear it. At first, just a faint whisper. Something that could have been the wind if there had been wind inside. I stopped, holding my breath. The silence returned. I kept walking, my heart now pounding harder. My steps were careful, almost fearful. I passed through a narrow hallway, its walls stained with dark patches, like shadows clinging to surface. At the end of the hall, a door. I didn't remember that door. It was slightly ajar, a small gap revealing an absolute darkness on the other side. A chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. My instinct screamed for me not to approach, but my feet kept moving as if they were no longer mine. I pushed the door open slowly. What I saw on the other side made me freeze. The darkness inside that room was different from any I had ever seen. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was something denser, deeper. It felt like if I stepped inside, I would never come out. My eyes tried to adjust, but the void seemed to absorb everything around it. I felt my heart hammering my throat, cold sweat trickling down my neck. Then I heard it. It wasn't exactly a sound, but the awareness that something was in there with me, an invisible presence, standing in the darkness, waiting for me to cross the threshold. My fingers trembled as they reached for the light switch beside the door. I pressed a button. Nothing. No light. I should have left at that moment. Any sane person would have. But I remained there, hypnotized by that darkness. There was something inside, something calling me. Then a sound, low, almost imperceptible, as if someone were breathing in there. My throat went dry. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that the silence of the house was playing tricks on my mind. But the breathing continued. Slow, deep, close. A shiver crawled up my spine. I stepped back, my entire body stiff with fear. But then something changed. The presence intensified. It was as if the thing knew I was hesitating, as if it had been waiting for that. My foot touched the floor behind me, and a loud creak echoed through the silence of the house. And that's when I saw it. Something moved within the darkness. I didn't see a face. I didn't see glowing eyes in the void. But the shadow, it moved in a way that wasn't human. Quick and silent, like a silhouette slithering through the dim light. My body reacted before my mind could. I turned on my heels and ran back through the hallway. My footsteps echoed, each beat of my feet against the floor blending with the terrifying rhythm of my own racing heart. I reached the front door and pulled at it with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. Did I lock it? No, I didn't lock it. My sweaty fingers slid over the doorknob, as I desperately tried to turn it. Nothing. The door felt sealed, as if the house itself refused to let me go. Behind me, footsteps. Not one, multiple. Soft, dragging steps coming from the hallway. I didn't want to look, but I did, and what I saw made me let out a scream I'll never forget. I saw shadows. They crawled to the corridor, twisting in impossible ways, as if they weren't bound by the laws of the human body. They weren't just dark shapes. They were holes in reality, voids where no light could exist. And they were coming for me. My lungs burned as I gasped for air, trying to keep control. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body was paralyzed, as if those shadows had some kind of hold over me. The door still wouldn't open. My hand shook violently as I pulled at the handle with all my strength, each attempt more desperate than the last. But it was useless. I was trapped, and they were getting closer. The hallway stretched, as if the house were folding in on itself. Each second felt like an eternity, and those shadows, those things, were already close enough for me to feel something inexplicable in the air around me, an intense, cutting cold, as if it were draining the warmth from my body. Then it happened, the whisper, soft, almost intimate. Words I didn't recognize, but somehow understood. You should have never come back. My vision blurred. The air around me felt heavier, as if invisible hands were pulling me into that living darkness. And then something touched me. It wasn't a physical touch. It was worse. It was as if the shadow itself had seeped into me, crawling through my veins, scratching at my mind with unseen fingers. My knees buckled. The floor disappeared beneath me. The house spun, or maybe I was falling into it. There was no longer a distinction between where I ended and where those things began. Desperation filled my chest. I fought to breathe, to move any part of my body, but it was like something was dragging me into an impossible void. Then, in the final moment, a different sound broke through the air, a sharp crack, and everything stopped. The darkness retreated, the weight lifted, and I found myself lying on the floor, alone. The door was open. I crawled outside, my hands scraping against the wooden floor as my breath came in short, ragged sobs. I didn't look back. The only thing I did was run without stopping, feeling the house shrink behind me, as if it had never existed. But I knew that thing was still inside, waiting, and the worst part? It let me leave because it wanted me to come back. I ran until my legs gave out. I ran until I tasted metal in my throat, and my lungs burned. When I finally stopped, I was far from the house, but the feeling that it was still watching me never faded. My hands trembled as I braced them against my knees, trying to catch my breath. The world around me felt unreal, as if I were still trapped inside that house, inside that darkness. But I had escaped, or at least that's what I thought. The days that followed were wrong. There was no other way to describe it. Something inside me had changed. I felt it in my own reflection, as if my eyes were no longer the same. The silence of the night seemed deeper. The dark corners of my home seemed to stretch just a little more than they should. I could hear the sound of wood creaking, even when no one else was around. And then the dreams began. At first, they were just flashes. The narrow corridor, the dark door, the writhing shadows. But as the days passed, the dreams became more vivid. I could smell the mold, feel the cold scratching at my skin, and worst of all, I could hear the whisper, "You should have never come back." The voice slithered into my mind like a thought that wasn't mine. I would wake up drenched in cold sweat, my breath caught in my throat, feeling as though something was watching me from the corner of the room. And then the blackouts began. Hours would disappear without explanation. I would find myself in places I didn't remember going to, holding objects I didn't remember picking up, My phone showed calls I had never made, messages sent to unknown numbers. But the worst happened 2 nights ago. I woke up in the middle of the night, sitting on the floor of my bedroom. My fingers were ice cold, covered in dirt. My heart pounded as I tried to understand what was happening. That's when I saw it. In my hand, I was holding a key, old, rusted, and I knew exactly where it came from. The house. Somehow, I had gone back there, but I didn't remember. I didn't remember leaving my apartment. I didn't remember walking there. I didn't remember picking up the key. But there it was in my hand. Heavy, real. A cold wave washed over me. I threw it far away, as if the mere touch of it could infect me. But it didn't matter. I knew what it meant. The house was still with me, and it wanted me to return. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my room, eyes fixed on the key lying on the floor like a forgotten corpse. That old, rusted piece of metal seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, as if it were waiting. The clock read 3:17 a.m. My hands were sweaty, my thoughts scrambled. I needed to convince myself that this was all in my head, that my mind was playing tricks on me ever since I stepped foot inside that house. But what if it wasn't? What if that thing had been with me ever since I left? I swallowed hard, forced myself to stand, picking up the key cautiously, as if I were about to touch something poisonous. The cold texture of the metal sent a shiver through me. What should I do? Throw it away? Bury it? But the real fear came with the next thought. What if it came back? I closed my eyes and tried to take a deep breath. I needed to think rationally. It was just a key, just an object with no real significance. But something inside me knew that wasn't true. That's when I heard it. The same creak. The same sound I had heard inside the house, when the door opened on its own. But now, it came from the back of my apartment. The air turned heavy. I didn't want to turn around. Every part of me screamed not to look, but something forced me to. Slowly, I turned my head toward the dark hallway leading to my living room. My heart pounded, my fingers clenched into fists. And then I saw it, a shadow, not just a dark blur, a form standing there at the end of the hallway. Tall, motionless, faceless, no defined contours, just a presence that shouldn't be there. I blinked, and it moved, not by walking, not by gliding. It was just closer. My lungs locked up, sweat dripped down my forehead. Ice cold. Another blink. Closer. The faint streetlight illuminated part of its body, but it didn't make sense. There was no texture, no depth. It was as if it were a hole in reality. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. My body was frozen. The sound of my own breathing felt too loud, mixing with the suffocating silence that filled the room. That's when I realized the shadow wasn't just standing there. It was watching me. Even without eyes, without a face, without features, it knew I was here, and it wanted me to know that too. My vision darkened for a moment, and then everything went silent. The shadow was gone. The room looked the same. The hallway was empty, but the air was still thick, as if something had passed through and left me a warning. I looked at the key, still in my hand. Now I knew the truth. The house never let me leave. It came with me, and it wouldn't leave me alone. I didn't leave my apartment the next day. The hours passed in a blur, each minute dragging like time itself was caught in a twisted loop. The sun rose, but it brought no relief. I felt surrounded. The presence was still here. Even without seeing it, I could feel it. With every shadow cast by the curtains, with every muffled noise from the other rooms, I knew it was still watching me. Fear was no longer a distant thing. It was part of me now. The key was still on the table. I should have thrown it away, burned it, broken it, but something stopped me, as if a part of me already knew the truth. Nothing would change. The house wanted me to return. And somehow, I knew it was only a matter of time before I obeyed. I spent the day trying to ignore the sensation of being watched, but the strange occurrences continued. Objects weren't where I had left them. The lights flickered, and then came the sound. At 2:47 a.m., I woke up to a knock at my front door. 3 dry knocks. I thought about staying still, pretending I wasn't there. But curiosity, that damn curiosity, made me get out of bed. I approached the door, my bare feet against the cold floor. Each step felt twice as heavy, as if I were being dragged toward that moment. Another sound, now stronger, a different knock, like something scratching at the door. I swallowed hard. My heart pounded against my ribs. I placed my hand on the doorknob. I hesitated. You should have never come back. The voice echoed inside my head like a distant whisper, as if something inside me already knew what was on the other side. But I turned the knob anyway. The door creaked open slowly, a long groan filling the silence. The darkness of the hallway outside seemed thicker than usual, as if it were solid. And then I saw it, the key. It was on the floor, placed neatly right in front of me, but I had left it inside my apartment. My eyes widened, my body tensed. I hadn't heard anyone approach. There were no footsteps, no movement, but now the key was there, waiting for me. The air around me grew heavy, almost suffocating, and then I felt it, something behind me, cold, still, watching. My body refused to move. Every muscle locked in absolute terror. I wanted to turn around. I needed to, but I didn't have time. The last thing I felt was an icy breath against my neck. And then the door slammed shut on its own, and darkness swallowed everything. I woke up on the floor. The cold wood against my skin was the first thing I felt. My head throbbed as if something had been pressing me down. The darkness still filled the room, but now it was different. It was the same darkness from the house. It took me a moment to move. Every muscle felt heavy, as if my body no longer belonged to me. My breath was uneven, and the smell was the same. Mold, dust, rot. I was no longer in my apartment. My fingers dug into the floor, searching for some kind of rational explanation. But there was none. The house had brought me back. The air was thick, difficult to breathe. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own shallow, erratic breaths. Slowly, I stood up, feeling my way around. The room was dark, but something told me I already knew where I was. The hallway. The same narrow hallway. The same damp, stained walls. The same invisible weight pressing against my skin. But something was different. This time, I wasn't alone. I couldn't see them, but I felt them. Presences, moving in the shadows, just perceptible enough for me to know they were there. Watching, waiting. I swallowed hard and took my first step. The sound echoed too loudly, sending a chill down my spine. The house wanted me here. But for what? I kept walking, every step increasing the feeling that something terribly wrong was about to happen. That's when I noticed the door, the same one I had opened before. This time, though, it was wide open. The darkness beyond it was absolute, but there was something inside, a faint glow, like a figure barely distinguishable. A slow, fluid movement, not human. I wanted to run. My body begged me to retreat, but I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward. The darkness called to me, as if I were being drawn into something far beyond my understanding. And then the whisper returned. It's too late now. The air around me turned ice cold, and in the next instant, the shadow moved toward me, fast, unstoppable, and before I could react, everything went black. There was nothing, no light, no sound, no time. I was floating in the void, unable to feel my own body. It was as if I had been torn from reality, thrown into a space where nothing existed except the awareness that I was still here. But I wasn't alone. I could feel them. The shadows, the presences, the nameless things that had dragged me back to the house. They were around me, touching without touching, whispering without sound. I tried to speak, to scream, but my voice was swallowed by the darkness. Then something changed. The void began to dissolve. The shadows slowly pulled away, and my body returned to existence. I was back, but it wasn't the same place. My eyes opened to a room I didn't recognize. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, faded and stained with dark patches. The ceiling was low, claustrophobic. The scent of dampness filled the air. And then I saw the photos. They covered the wall in front of me. Hundreds of them, yellowed, worn by time. And they all had one thing in common. They were photos of me. My chest tightened. My heartbeat roared in my ears. I hesitated, my fingers trembling as I touched one of the images. And then I noticed something worse. The photos didn't just show me. There was something else in them. Something in the background of each image. A dark silhouette, always standing in the same place. Always watching me. It had been there all along, even before I had entered that house. My breath caught. My knees went weak. I no longer knew what was real. That's when I noticed a mirror in the corner of the room. And I saw it. The shadow was behind me. Close. Too close. And this time it smiled. My body froze. The reflection in the mirror showed the shadow standing behind me, motionless, but alive. It had no eyes, no mouth, but I knew it was smiling. That smile I couldn't see but could feel. My instinct screamed for me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air around me felt denser, as if the space itself was folding in on me. Then the mirror groaned. At first, it was a soft sound like cracking glass, but within seconds, it became something much worse. The surface of the mirror began to distort, cracking like thin ice. My reflection fractured, but the shadow remained whole. And then, without warning, it moved. Too fast. Too impossible to follow. And before I could react, the mirror shattered. The shards didn't fall. They floated in the air, spinning around me like dead stars, devoid of light. Silence reigned. And then I saw it. The thing inside the mirror was now outside. It watched me, no longer separated by a barrier. And then it spoke. You were never real. The world trembled. And then everything disappeared. When I opened my eyes, I was back. In my apartment, the key was still there. The mirror was still whole. And everything seemed exactly as before. Except for one thing. I was no longer the same. My reflection looked back at me. And this time, it blinked first.